Welcome back. You're watching The Globe here on SABC News Channel, continuing with some regional and international news, and we will tell you in a short while about the health of the Queen of Britain. The monarch said to have contracted COVID-19, all of that coming up and more. But now we remain here in South Africa, where President Cyril Ramaphosa has praised the SANDF for the role it played on quelling the civil unrest experienced in both KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng last year. Ramaphosa says the country is always reassured that the South African National Defence Force is there as the last line in restoring order, maintaining calm and defending the territorial integrity of the country. He was speaking at the commemoration of Armed Forces Day in Mpumalanga. The SABC's Yolisa Njamela has more on that.
Honoring and celebrating men and women in uniform. In true military style and precision, crowds here were treated to well-coordinated army drills and death-defying aircraft maneuvers. A mass flypast showcased the different aircraft the Air Force currently uses for a variety of missions in South Africa as well as on the continent. Speaking as the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, President Cyril Ramaphosa says members of the SANDF have served the country with distinction under difficult conditions. He highlighted the Army's role in containing the July unrests.
The terrible experiences of July 2021 unrest has left deep wounds. It tested the authority of the state and the strength of our democracy. At that moment of great crisis, the sight of a uniformed SANDF member out there and just the sight of a SANDF vehicle keeping us safe, restoring calm, gave assurance at a time when many were fearful.
The president also expressed pride in the SANDF, saying it continues to drive development and resolve the service delivery challenges that impact people's lives.
SANDF has more than lived up to this task, particularly over the past year when our country endured great tribulations and trials. How apt, then, is the saying that the truest measure of courage is perseverance under pressure. As the Commander-in-Chief of the SANDF, I could not be prouder of our soldiers and of all of you who are here.
The president also acknowledged the challenges the SANDF faces in achieving its mandate. He says the military, like every other organ of the state, has had to conduct its substantial operations in the face of extremely limited resources and a growing catalogue of commitments.
I commend the leadership of our military and all members of our armed forces for fulfilling their responsibilities even as we grapple with funding challenges that affect various defense programs and development activities. We are looking within these constraints at ways to better resource our defense force with the tools they need to fulfill their mandate.
The National Defence Force have been struggling to hold the Armed Forces Day due to a number of challenges, including the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite this, they were determined to host a limited event this year.
The leadership of the various sections of the South African National Defence Force that we spoke to told us that this event is not just ceremonial, but also about showcasing the roles and responsibilities of the SANDF members. Yolisa Njamela for SABC News in Bombela City, Mpumalanga Province.
Right, let's talk a little bit more about this Armed Forces Day. We're joined now by Defence Analyst Helmoed Heitman. A very good Evening to you. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Mr. Heitman. Now, the day looks back at what happened decades ago with regards to SS Mendi and the men who died as a result of that. So talk to us about that tragedy and how we relate to it today, the relevance, the importance of this day in post-democratic South Africa.
Look, I think that part of it, the Mendi part of it, is really stressing that at the end of the day, when everything else is sorted out, military personnel are willing to risk their lives and lose their lives sometimes for the interests of the country. That's what makes the military, and to a lesser extent, but also practically the police, different to everybody else. You know, the rest of us can hide in a hole in the ground if we feel like it. Soldiers cannot. Not all of them die in battle, of course. Some die in nasty incidents like Mendi, and there have been other incidents like that. But it's the same thing, and the courage involved is also the same.
The President speaking about that when he honoured all the men and women in uniform who have lost their lives in the line of duty at home and on external operations, as he said. How many external operations is South Africa actively involved in as we speak?
At the moment, really only two, which is the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we've got a battalion and some helicopters and some other elements in the eastern part of the country, and then in the north of Mozambique in Cabo Delgado. And we're supposed to still be patrolling the Mozambique Channel to prevent piracy getting started there, but the Navy hasn't been able to do that. But if you go back a bit, we've previously been involved in Burundi, in Darfur, in Comoros, and of course briefly in the Central African Republic, and also very briefly in Cote d'Ivoire, and there have been a couple of smaller operations as well. So Defence Force has actually been quite busy. Even things like the independence of South Sudan that provided the radar to provide air traffic control at Juba. They provided some security elements. They've done a lot of work.
Right, so let's go a little bit more into all of these. There's the involvement in Cabo Delgado in Mozambique as part of the SADC mission there. What do you anticipate in terms of how that security situation will unfold, and if there has been an ability to quell the insurgency, rather more medium to long term?
Look, the problem with any insurgency is it's very much a long-term game. You don't undo an insurgency in months or even a year or two. You're probably betting on average about a decade. The other problem in Cabo Delgado specifically now is that even together with the Rwandan contingent there, the SABC force is vastly too small to do the job. You need a lot more troops there. You need lots. There's an old rule of thumb that for every guerrilla you need 10 soldiers. Not because guerrillas are such great fighters, but because you've got to find them first and you've got to protect a lot of things. On that basis, there should be somewhere between 15 and 20,000 troops in Cabo Delgado. You know, not 4,000 or 5,000 at its peak if the SADC ever gets around to deploying everybody. The force is also much too lightly armed. So what you've seen, particularly where the Rwandan troops came in initially, is guerrillas doing what they always do. When regular troops arrive, they step aside and blend away in the shadows and wait till the soldiers go away again. And we've seen that. Where the troops go away, the killing resumes. They've expanded into the next door province. They may yet expand southwards. Its effort, bluntly, is not enough. It's not going to suppress the insurgency. We can fool ourselves, but it's not going to work.
I mean, it's important to ask this question. As you mentioned, the Democratic Republic of Congo, of which we have been heavily invested, and the hostilities that continue to rage on and worsen, particularly in the eastern parts of the country. What can South Africa do there going forward, and how much of that is instructive in how to deal with, as you say, long-term insurgencies which are deeply entrenched, and a lot of that has to do, as you say, with on-the-ground support?
Look, yes, and I mean, you know, there is no military solution to an insurgency. The military have to first provide some measure of stability and security. But then the civilian government has to step up and provide proper government services, get an economy going again, and do that. Now, that has not happened really in the east of the Congo. It has not happened so far in Cabo Delgado. And if that doesn't happen, you're not going to quell the insurgency. It's as basic as that. The military is a small part of it. It's the first part. It's the essential part, because without security, nothing there's not going to be any development. But it's not the actual solution. The solution is socio-political, socio-economical. You've got to get an economy going, you've got to provide government services, you've got to give the people in that area a stake in the country. Failing that, it just continues forever. And the third problem in the Congo is the same as in Cabo Delgado. The United Nations force MONUSCO is too weak, both in numbers and the level of its equipment, to actually do the job properly.
It's interesting that you say that, because we also played a very significant role in negotiations in the Sudan. I mean, that also involved having a very nuanced approach, although some were very critical of our approach to the negotiations there. That included talking to the warring or the differing parties. So have we been successful in what we were able to achieve in the Sudan? Obviously, this had a lot to do with South Sudan, but they're all very much related, the conflicts in that area.
Look, they are. And again, South Sudan for a while unraveled again. It's a bit more stable now. We'll have to see how it turns out. The problem also is, of course, that Sudan itself is not all that stable. And that inevitably impacts South Sudan, as does the situation in the northeast of the DRC. They're all, to some extent, interlinked. Even Somalia, for instance, is interlinked with these things. So it's a long-term, very complex situation that really should require all the governments to work together properly and, bluntly, put more forces on the ground and then follow up with proper socio-economic and socio-political efforts. And that latter part has simply not happened pretty much anywhere, if you look. That remains a problem.
I'd like to finish off with going back to the event today and what was referred to by the President, the financing and the strength of our military. He mentioned the role of the SANDF during the July unrest last year, COVID-19. But I'd like to hear your assessment of our army, like an organ of every other organ of the state. He said the army has had to conduct its substantial operations in the face of extremely limited resources. Is there room for change?
Well, when he says that, he understates the situation. The Defence Force has seen its budget cut by more than half since around 1990, whereas the actual number of things it's supposed to do has increased all the time. So, unlike other government departments, it has not kept up with its funding at all. It's been vastly more underfunded than anybody else, and there's some government, not going to name any, but there's some government departments that waste vast amounts of money that we should probably take them away. The problem we now have is that the Defence Force, as a Defence Force, is basically starting to fade. Equipment that cannot be maintained, let alone modernised, upgraded. Capability gaps like maritime patrol aircraft can't be closed. So sooner or later, it's all going to grind to a sticky standstill. I mean, one example of that was we have armed forces today, and we did not have the Gripen fighters flying as part of the fly past. And the Gripens are the key part of the Air Force. And they weren't flying because they haven't been able to organise a support contract with SAB, who provide the technology support for the aircraft. That's partly a funding problem.
Thank you so much for speaking to us, military expert Helmoed Heitman. We're going to take a quick break. When we return, more news, including some news that's just coming.